The continent of Africa has the longest history of anywhere on Earth. Its people built civilizations that rivaled those that existed anywhere in the world. Yet, most of us don't know much about this history, and the little we do know projects a distorted, partial picture, usually by non-Africans and mostly by white Europeans. These are some of Africa's brightest and best, students at Lagos University in Nigeria. What do they know about their own history?
Well, I know that Nigeria got the amalgamation started from 1914.
But you can't go back before the 20th century?
No.
Oh.
Well, it's my African culture, and I would like to know about my ancestors, how they lived, and how everything came about into existence.
Do you think there's a gap in African students' knowledge about the history of their own continent?
So much, I think, yeah, so much gap.
The lack of knowledge shown by these students comes as no surprise to Nigerian professor Anthony Asiwaju, one of the original contributors to the General History of Africa. He believes the teaching of history is neglected right across the continent.
I'm sorry that I don't have very good news on that. African history has virtually been kicked out of the syllabus in secondary schools. Most departments of history in our universities are barely trying to survive. And it's not just in Nigeria, it's all over Africa.
Paris, the headquarters of UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. It was here that a great plan was developed to rewrite Africa's history from the perspective of Africans themselves. It was an ambitious idea conceived in that period of rapid decolonisation, the 1960s. Africans had managed to throw off their colonial oppressors. It was now time for them to reclaim their past. Twice a year in this rather workmanlike room at UNESCO, some of the finest minds from across Africa and experts from elsewhere in the world are gathering to compile and update the general history of Africa. They are at the forefront of a revolution that is the current cultural and educational renaissance taking place in Africa. Ali Musa Iye of UNESCO says the general history of Africa was and is an ambitious project.
So when the African leaders, the new leaders came after the independence, this is one of the first things they request from UNESCO. Why UNESCO? Because it's the organization, intergovernmental organization in charge of the fight against ignorance and the promotion for the mutual understanding. So they came to assist them to rewrite the history. So UNESCO take the challenge, take it seriously, and UNESCO managed to mobilize around 350 historian experts, other specialists, to really rewrite and to change the perspective on African history.
Professor Elikia Mbakolo encapsulates the grand vision and mission behind the general history of Africa. The volumes begin many thousands of years ago in a period known as prehistory and bring us right to the modern era.
Je suis Elikia Mbakolo, historien et professeur des universités. J'ai participé à la rédaction de l'Histoire générale de l'Afrique qui s'est terminée au début des années 1990. C'est un travail savant de plus de 8000 pages et on s'est rendu compte très vite que ces gros livres dormaient dans les bibliothèques et n'étaient connus de pas grand monde, ni les professeurs, ni les élèves, ni les étudiants. Et l'autre problème inquiétant, c'est que depuis les années 60, l'enseignement de l'histoire en Afrique est devenu de plus en plus un enseignement national. Chaque pays enseignait l'histoire de sa nation. L'OUA a été transformée en Union africaine Et on s'est rendu compte qu'on avait besoin de citoyens africains et pas seulement de citoyens algériens, congolais, zimbabwéens ou sud-africains.
The General History of Africa is not simply gathering dust. Through its team of consultants, the present 8 volumes, completed 15 years ago, are being updated, as history professor Dulai Konati explains.
Il y a aussi la question des réinterprétations, ou disons, parce que nos devanciers qui ont écrit les 8 volumes de l'histoire générale de l'Afrique n'avaient pas certains documents. Et vous savez, l'histoire, c'est une permanente construction. Et ce qui est vrai aujourd'hui peut ne pas l'être demain parce qu'on a trouvé de nouveaux documents. Et donc aujourd'hui, nous avons accès à d'autres sources qui nous permettent d'analyser un certain nombre de phénomènes différemment.
And Professor Augustine Hole is now leading the team that has been given 3 years to oversee the completion of the 9th volume of the General History of Africa, which will bring us to events and Pan-African trends that are taking place today.
We are looking at the contribution of diasporan Africans to the liberation of Africa. The first through the political discourse, and second through movements like the independence of Haiti, and Haiti have been very influential in the liberation of Africa. We are looking at issues like gender issues, the environment, the colonization of new land in Africa, the youth issues, and urbanization and urban explosion, and also the most critical issue about economies, the structural adjustment and the consequences of these issues on contemporary Africa today.
How much opposition was there from the traditional Western historians to Africans themselves writing their own history?
There was a huge conflict, as you can imagine. It was not easy to change their perspective on African history, but there was a very strong intellectual and scientific confrontation between, on one side, the African historian, and the other side, the Africanists. The first point of opposition and conflict was to say, well, Africa have not written archives, so we can't really talk about an African perspective of history. And the African scholars said, no, we can also make history with other sources.
There were written records, of course, which European historians didn't always consider looking at. There are records, for instance, in Arabic, Swahili and Hindi, illustrating the way people lived, recording trade agreements and administrative details which give us an insight into different communities. These records also help us understand how Africans became part of communities outside their own continent, the early diaspora. Sheila Walker is from the African diaspora and has studied these communities wherever they may be, in her native United States, as well as Latin America and Asia. She's one of the editors of the General History of Africa.
Well, unfortunately, diaspora Africans every place are pretty much uninformed about their history. There are no educational processes that any place that teach diaspora history in any kind of systematic way, and so they don't know. On the contrary, in so many cases, the fact that the diaspora has a history has been denied. From the United States, I officially learned that we, U.S. African Americans, had no culture, no history to be proud of. That we had no links with Africa because, of course, back in the day, Africa was considered savage, it had no history, it had no culture. Well, most African descendants are concentrated in the Americas. Brazil is the second African country on the planet after Nigeria. So we are the second, we in the United States are the second African diasporan population, and then I think it's Colombia. So we have Portuguese-speaking, English-speaking, and then Spanish-speaking. After that, it's probably Haiti. But if you go to India, there are Afro-Indian populations. There's that old population that's been there for maybe 40,000 years in the South, but then there are populations who've been there for the last 800 years. So in India, for example, there's several totally separate populations. There's a population in Gujarat, there's a population in Hyderabad, there's a population in Karnataka. They have different histories, they have different presence, but they have cultural concepts similar to us in the diaspora.
On the Indian subcontinent, this community in Sri Lanka, for instance, claim to trace their ancestry back to Africa. They still maintain their traditions, but also make a living through enactments of their old way of life for tourists. They obligingly demonstrated their ancient hunting skills for us. The General History of Africa also drew on the great tradition of storytelling in Africa, the oral tradition of passing on information through stories and songs. Just because there is this oral tradition in Africa doesn't mean there's no history to document. I've come to the University of Lagos to meet the head of the history department, Professor Funke Adeboye. How difficult does the lack of written records make it for historians teaching the subject today?
Before written records, before you have the recollection of oral traditions, then we can talk of prehistory. And for such a period, we have to look for other sources to give us historical data. As historians, if you are working on the prehistorical period and you do not have written records, then you have to look for alternative sources. And for these alternative sources, we look towards discipline like archaeology, linguistics, paleobotany, paleozoo, and a host of other related sources.
Paleontology, with its rich field of sub-disciplines like palynology, brings us much knowledge of our past.
I'm a palynologist, and as a palynologist, we look at pulling grains and spores of plants. Why are we doing it? It's for us to know the plants of the past. So it's historic in a way too. It's an aspect of history.
Paleontologists like Dr. Adekambi can help tell us what ape men had for breakfast, where conditions were wet enough to provide our human ancestors with food, and help us work out what killed them. One of the most popular and effective ways of understanding Africa's early history is archaeology. And a leading practitioner in this field is Abdeljalil Bouzourar from Morocco, here on a visit in Oxford.
If you want to know more about the early humans, I think South Africa or East Africa are the best places. And North Africa has also its story to tell, which is very important, for example, for the Middle Stone Age and the transition between Middle Stone Age and Late Stone Age. And also the, what can I say, all this story of the modern behavior, which is extremely important for the human beings. We have more information about the way of hunting by these people, especially during the Middle Stone Age, because we found some tools, and these tools, they were really made in order to hunt, or such I would say a lot of animals such as gazelles, and sometimes they hunted horses.
So the General History of Africa draws on the expertise of specialists across a variety of fields. It's a fascinating history that illustrates how Africa is the cradle of humankind. Lindiwe Mashangu is a guide at the Maropeng Visitor Centre, a UNESCO World Heritage Site in South Africa.
Before we actually get to talk about Maropeng here, we need to understand what Maropeng is. The word Maropeng has been named in Setswana. That's because Setswana is the indigenous language to this area. It means returning back to the place of origins. It's our origins, it's yours, and everyone else that comes through. Welcome home. About 250,000 of visitors that we get to expect each and every year, mostly made of school groups internationally as well as South Africans. Human populations seems to be so different in terms of so many things. We could be looking at color, and different proportions that we get to look at. So many of us. But at the end of the day, we happen to be virtually identical. We are born from the same species, Homo sapiens. Now, not everyone who actually comes through to Maropeng is coming here with the understanding of what the theory of evolution is and what actually it entails. Most commonly, we would actually find that people are coming through to the cradle of humankind to find out if they truly are the descendants of the apes.
Africa's future may lie in its development of industry, science and technology. But surely, as the General History of Africa says, a people without a past cannot have a future. And if your history is written by others, you are also a people robbed of identity. This is not a problem that we can consign to the distant past. South African professor Francis Thackeray is an evolutionary scientist working in Johannesburg. He spent his adult life studying the origins of humankind in Africa, but growing up under the apartheid regime, this was a particularly difficult career to pursue.
In the 1960s, when I was at school in Pretoria, evolution was forbidden, and the history books in the curricula started with Jan van Riebeeck, a Dutch explorer who was instructed to settle in Cape Town in 1652. And at the time, when I was a schoolboy, I learned that history began in South Africa with the arrival of the Dutch colonists. I was lucky as a schoolboy because I belonged to a private school, and in my first history lesson, I was taught not about the Dutch settlement, but I was taught about the Big Bang and the evolution of life on Earth over 14 billions of years, and it made a big impact on me. That was an exception. By and large, most South African children in the 1950s and 60s were being taught the traditional view that history began in South Africa with the arrival of Dutch colonists.
There is not a single part of Africa which hasn't suffered from colonialism or repression by outside powers, and we are still living with the legacy of that oppression today. With the televisation of the General History of Africa through the generous sponsorship of Morocco's OCP, Kush Communications, in partnership with UNESCO, will be making better known the history of Africa and its people. A history written by Africans themselves, for Africans and non-Africans alike.